As many of you know, we've been studying leading up to Passover for the past really couple months, whether it's been the classes that we've offered or specific preparing for Passover shiurim. And one of those things that I taught on some weeks ago was this idea of the four cups. Now, I know that many of us have learned, and we look in our Haggadot, that the four cups are because of the four blessings of redemption, that God makes these promises of redemption. And in fact, that was the teaching that went out. But in truth, there are so many other opinions as to why we have the four cups. That's the one, of course, that makes it into 99% of the Haggadot. And I don't want to dwell on the idea that the number four is a formulaic number, right? We know about four in so many different ways in our Torah and in our Jewish narrative. And in fact, just in our Exodus, we see the number four, be that with 40 years or 40 days on the mountaintop and on and on and on. But I don't want to dismiss that just because four is a special number in our tradition, that in itself is a reason. We studied together over the past few weeks, looking at the Vilna Gaon, that the Vilna taught that the four cups represent periods of time. That is our world right now, the Messianic era, the world at resurrection, the world to come. Abarbanel taught about four different redemptions when God chose Abraham, our period right now of the Exodus, the time of the exile, and a fourth to come. But I actually think that there's a far greater and much deeper connection and reason for the four cups, and I'm going to challenge all of us to embrace this reason for our Seder tonight. Much like me, the Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Judah Low, saw our Torah, our calendar, and really our faith as a sphere. Nothing at all is linear. You don't go from one Torah portion to the next. You don't go from one Hallel to the next. It's as if every part of this sphere intersects and you could drop a line and an anchor and everything is all connected and separated all at once. And so likewise, there wasn't a linear progression from one Hallel to the next one or one story to the next, that everything becomes intersectional. And the point of Passover itself is to recognize the idea that everything is intersected. And likewise, all components of Jewish mysticism operate the same way, that every teaching within Jewish mysticism is predicated on a previous notion of Judaism, and every teaching is predicated on that moment itself, so that we could look ahead and look backwards all at once. And though we are observing Passover right now, we might look ahead to Shavuot, because that seems like it makes sense. Tonight, we're going to count the Omer, the first night of the Omer, because that's where the linear progression is. It brings us. But we have to remember that these are the Shalosh Regalim. And it's not just Passover, it's not just Shavuot, it's also Sukkot. And so while Passover looks ahead at Shavuot, it also looks backwards at Sukkot. We think about this in our tradition all the time because we have two teachings about the new year. We think about Rosh Hashanah and that collection of that season. And we think about Pesach as this collection of this season, one new year versus another. Now, though we might think that that means that Passover may parallel Rosh Hashanah, it's actually better suited within the idea of hosting and hospitality and welcoming strangers, that Pesach is a better parallel to Sukkot. Even in our calendar itself, if we think about the length of the holiday, Passover actually makes more sense to parallel Sukkot than it does to Shavuot. We've got 7, albeit 8 days of Sukkot. We've got 7, albeit 8 days of Pesach. And likewise, even the narrative itself, if we start looking at the commentary, we start understanding the ritual and the observance of our tradition. Why do we build Sukkot? Because the Israelites traveled during the Exodus in Ananei Kavod, these clouds of glory. And so the Sukkot are representative of the clouds of glory that accompanied the Israelites during the Exodus, which we observe and celebrate during Passover. All of that put aside, you'll remember that we're talking about the four cups. The four cups is one symbolic interpretation of something we do on Sukkot. On Sukkot, we have our tradition of ushpizin. We welcome guests. Now, we don't have an actual symbolic gesture or ritual for ushpizin, other than welcoming ushpizin and reading an Aramaic formula to welcome these ushpizin. Ushpizin, if you haven't played along at home, it's the idea of welcoming these mystical ancestral guests into our Sukkot. We welcome Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebecca, and on and on and on. And there are actually different collections and teachings. The tradition began with welcoming just the Avot, the patriarchs, but in more progressive times over the past several centuries, we've welcomed the Imahot as well. I share this because at least at our sukkah, our tradition is to go around the table, and every single person, not only do we welcome the Avot and Imahot, but we ask, who would we like to have in our sukkah, living or past? Who would we like to bring into our temporary home for this holy day? And sometimes we bring up famous individuals that we want to gain their wisdom. Sometimes we bring up past deceased relatives that we want to meet for the first time or experience their love because we miss them. But there isn't a symbol on the table that serves as the ritual. We bring the Siddur and we read the tradition. On Passover, we literally say it. Anyone who is hungry, anyone who needs, come and eat. This is the holiday of Ushpizin. So we have to kind of force it into Sukkot, and we forget about it on Pesach, and we forget about it all the more so during a year like this with a pandemic where we're not generally inviting guests into our home. But I say this, why don't we have the same mystical Ushpizin that we have at Sukkot? Why don't we say, oh, here's Abraham, here's Sarah, here's Isaac, here's Rebecca. We welcome you to our Seder table. The truth is, we do. According to the Maharal, the 4 cups at our Seder represent the Imahot, and the 3 matzot represent the Avot. And so when we set our Seder table and we pour those 4 cups and we place the 3 matzot, those become our ushpizin. Not in the Catholic way of transubstantiation, that the bread becomes the body and the wine becomes the blood. Not that they actually transform into them, but they become a toast to each one and a meal in homage to each one. And so that our intention as we drink and eat is to invite the presence of our ancestors to our table. And we should note that unlike the ushpizin of the ritual of Sukkot, where we actually, over the past several hundred years, to be more progressive and inclusive, added the Imahot to our sukkah, Rabbi Judah Loew of Prague said, no. This tradition of the 3 matzot and the 4 cups, that is based on the matriarchs and the patriarchs, and has been since the beginning of time of this tradition of Seder. And so tonight, as you sit down again to eat Seder and drink your 4 cups, we have to remember that this is to be a festival of egalitarianism, of equality, of freedom. And as we reflect, tonight, we toast the matriarchs especially. Sarah at Kadesh as the one who helped us find holiness. Rebecca at Magid, who taught us how to craftily weave a story. Rachel at Barech, who taught us to recognize blessings in the world. And Leah at Hallel, who taught us to offer praise even when it was the most difficult. This is our opportunity tonight, not to reclaim promises of freedom, to reclaim our ancestors and fill those chairs that otherwise might seem empty. Chag Sameach.